Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is Wednesday, March 27th. I am your host, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We are going to start with some new rules at the NFL level and talk about how it's very possible they might find their way down to the college football level. Then we're going to jump into RG3. He had some comments last week talking about Caleb Williams and possibly denying the Bears drafting him, essentially. And then he had some additional comments against Shedeur Sanders, and Ryan Poles responded to RG3, so wanted to break down all of that for you guys. Then we're going to jump into breakout players for 2024. This has become a very, very common segment on this show. I'm starting to reach my wit's end with it, but at the end of the day, we have a good part 4 for you today, a SEC-themed part 4 for you today, and then we're going to finish it off with a Spotlight Wednesday. And today we're going to talk about the Clemson Tigers. Obviously, a lot going on around that program. The national perception of Clemson is changing day by day, so a huge year ahead of them for Dabo Swinney and company. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all that we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen, you can see your name, your question, and I can respond to it, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all, because you get to see your questions on the screen, get to see your name on the screen, and maybe bring up something that I either hadn't brought up or just a question you had about the topic I was talking about. So, but let's jump right in. The NFL just adopted a couple of new rule changes that are kind of taking the world by storm right now. There is one that I think most people are for, and I think there's one that most people are against. And why don't we start with the one that most people are against? They have officially banned the hip drop tackle in the NFL football, and I do think that a lot of these rules have the chance to roll down to college football. That's why we're talking about them on the college football show. We've seen, helmet communication and the 2-minute warning already this year is being introduced, and it's very possible that more are going to come after it. And the kickoff rule in particular, I know, is one that the College Football Rules Committee is looking at very closely, but the hip drop is a little bit grayer. I haven't necessarily heard any concrete news on that, so why don't we start there, and then we'll jump into what's going on with the kickoff, because that one's a little bit more convoluted. But the hip drop tackle, if anyone is unaware, if you were watching the Ravens games throughout the year, you knew that Mark Andrews, their star tight end, had been injured for a long time. That happened on what they were calling a hip drop tackle. I'm not exactly sure what the injury was. I believe it was something with his knee, but basically Logan Thomas of the Bengals was tackling him from behind, basically dropped his hips, as they say, and landed on his back legs, and he got twisted up and hurt something in his lower leg. I can't remember if it was ankle or a knee, but first of all, I have no issue with the NFL or any football league trying to protect the athletes. Obviously, this is a very dangerous game we play, and it's super important for everyone to be able to go out there and be as safe as possible. Obviously, there's certain things that are out of their control, but as safe as they can possibly be is the most important thing, and I fully understand where they're coming from with making this rule in regards to that. However, there are a couple of problems with this rule, and it's the problems that everyone else has. First of all, hip drop is not necessarily a term that players even knew before last year. I don't think this is a term that was invented by players. I don't think this is a term that was invented by coaches. I think it is something that makes it easier for, whether that is rules committee members or owners or fans, to understand what's going on a certain play. So I don't think this is something that players necessarily do with any. I don't think they're necessarily aware that they're doing it. They're just trying to tackle someone, and in tackling a 280-pound tight end, sometimes you got to use your weight, and that's just kind of the way things go. So hip drop tackles aren't really a thing. Obviously, there are some that, show, the linebacker or the DB using all of their weight to bring the guy down. But that's not necessarily what I would dub a hip drop tackle, because I don't think there's really such thing. I think there's just such thing as tackling someone from behind. So the reality of all of this is football is a very dangerous sport, and slowly we've been trying to make it a little bit less dangerous and make sure that there's not these catastrophic injuries. And it's a huge deal for the future of football, because the more these catastrophic injuries pop up, the more the people on the other side of the fence that say there should be no such thing as football or should be entirely flag football are going to slowly start to win. And that's just kind of the way things are. The more aggressive injuries you have, the more you have to pay attention to those type of things. So obviously this is something that you have to pay attention to, and you have to try your darndest to make sure that it doesn't get in the way or hurt any excess amount of players. But at the end of the day, this is football. This is a game where it's going to be violent. It's going to be dangerous. Kids are going to get hurt. And that's just kind of something that you can't avoid no matter how many rules are put into place. We've seen targeting be put into place, and although I'm sure the numbers overall of concussions and that type of thing are down, I'm part of the group that tends to believe it might not be down for the reason that everyone thinks it is, that, they're actually not concussed. I think certain players just try to shake it off and keep it moving. And so there's a double-edged sword to every one of these rules, and I think this one's no different. I think mainly my biggest worry with this rule is targeting. The big problem is there is a lot of nuance within that rule, and they've started to kind of take the nuance out of it and it become a little bit more clear-cut, but that's been tough to do. Now, this one has infinite amount of nuance because no one really knows what they're looking for. I'll be totally honest with you, because this is not a thing that most players know what they're doing, most coaches coach. So it's one of those things where defenders in NFL and in college football to a certain extent are essentially being told you can't do a lot. You can't hit them high, don't hit them low. You can't hit them from behind, so if you're beat, just kind of let them go. Also, don't land on them if you're tackling them. There's so many different things that they have to think about while also trying to play the best defense they can. And it's taking a certain amount of the competitive advantage, or not competitive advantage, but it's putting competitive advantage towards the offense more and more. And it's something that obviously more points are really fun. Obviously, we love to see a ton of points on the scoreboard, but it's not football. Football is meant to be, a battle between two sides of the ball that are giving everything they have and are on steady footing with each other. It's not, the offense having the ability to essentially do what they want, and then when the defense makes a play, a flag being thrown and them getting 15 more yards. So obviously this hip drop tackle is very controversial. I think in my eyes it's a little ridiculous. I think there will be a number of games throughout the season that are being defined by these calls, and they'll be wrong, or at least they'll be confusing because no one really knows what they're looking for. So I tend to think this one will probably not find its way down to college football, but who knows? Because at the end of the day, the NFL has implemented a lot of these rules that I thought were a little ridiculous, and they're still here today. So who am I to say what they're going to do and how it will trickle down to college football? But let's get to the kickoff rule, because I know that college football is looking into this. Seth Emerson over at The Athletic did a great piece about the kickoff rule and how the college football powers that be are kind of looking at it. Kirby Smart was a big topic, was a big source in this article talking about the merits of it and how they're looking at the NFL for this and kind of tinkering with it as they go. He is a part of the rules committee for the NCAA, so that is obviously a huge piece of this. Those are the group of people that would implement this rule and get it in front of college football faces. So to break down the rule, before we get into the weeds of what it means for college football, the rule is kickoffs are still at the 35. So the kicker will still be kicking the ball from the 35 yard from their own 35-yard line, but 10 players on the kicking team will now line up at the opposing team's 40-yard line. So they will be separated by 25 yards, the kicker and the rest of the kick team, so 10 players. And then the returning team will be on their own 35. So that means there will only be 5 yards separating these two groups. So 10 players on the 40 and then 9 players on the 35, as there's usually 2 returners on a kickoff return in college football. So, or in college football and in the NFL, really. But so then you'll have 2 players deep. So it's obviously a very different formation. It will limit the amount of time that these guys have to pick up speed and have these big time collisions. And also, it'll add some very interesting strategy to the game that was not there before, that I'll get into here in a minute. But the kickoff team cannot move until the ball is inside the 20-yard line. So that is a huge rule. Obviously, they will be giving a head start to the returner on a lot of these cases. And touchbacks are now moved to the receiving team's 30. So no longer can you kick it out of the back of the end zone and still be put at the 20. Now you're at the 30, and the team has a little bit more momentum going in their direction. So this will obviously lead to many more returns. I think that's very clear. You're going to want to return the ball. You're going to want to be able to get as far upfield as possible. Obviously, you have essentially they'll be catching the ball usually inside the 10 or the 5, so about 20-25 yards will separate you and the rest of the group, and that gives you a lot of space to work with different trick plays, with a lot of speed on the field for some of these teams, and it'll be really interesting to see how all of this develops. I mean, in the NFL, someone like Tyreek Hill running this is almost unfair because you almost get the ball at the 30 every single time, because the second he catches the ball, he's pretty much 20 yards downfield. So he's someone that I would not be surprised if they placed him back there on kickoffs for the Miami Dolphins this year. But talking more back to the college football world, this is something that has been kicked around for a while. They've met with NFL people as this has gone through. And Kirby said he is in favor of the rule, but he didn't necessarily say because of the, safety implications. Obviously, I'm sure he's not necessarily opposed to that by any means. I think he is a fan of the safety implications that this does have. But Kirby really was a big favor of this because it used to be, for a long time in his head coaching career especially, you would get guys out on special teams, and early on in his career when he was a coordinator or a position coach, those would be valuable reps because guys were returning kicks and you'd have to set up different angles and different packages for the way you wanted to run down the field and attack and all of these different things. So those were very valuable reps before they could get reps at their own position. Slowly, that's kind of changed, and I'll take you through kind of the touchback numbers throughout college football because it would make a lot of sense for them to adopt this. In 2023, it was up to 49.6%. In 2020, it was at 41.2%. 2019 was 43.6%, so I don't really know what happened in 2020, but a massive increase has been happening over the last couple of years in touchbacks, and it's made these reps for the third string linebacker or the third string running back or the safety or whatever it is, have made those way less important and way less valuable because you're essentially just sprinting down the field and coming on back. So I think now you have the ability to take on a block pretty much every single time. You will work on shedding that block. You'll work on open field tackling. You'll work on angles of, how to attack someone coming off an angle. All of these great things that are super important to especially someone like a linebacker or a safety. Those are super important traits to have. And being able to work those out in special teams is going to be a huge benefit to these young players to, once they get on the field, be able to jump in and be ready to go. And also, just finally, one last thing about this, special teams coordinators for a long time have been kind of the unsung heroes of a lot of these teams. Obviously, they do incredible work, but when you talk about a team, you talk about offensive and defensive coordinators. Special teams coordinators are about to become way more important at the NFL level, and then if it's adopted into college football, at the college football level. And there are a ton of really incredible ones out there that are already doing incredible work, but at the end of the day, their hands are kind of tied for how much they can do on a kickoff return. Now they're no longer really tied. They can kind of play around with things, do different things, and especially early on, if this rule was to be adopted, it changes the entire way that teams have to prepare. So those first couple of weeks could be a ton of trick plays, a ton of weird plays, and maybe some touchdowns off kickoff. So I'm very excited for this rule. The hip drop tackle, I really hope that college football is able to avoid, because I think it's going to be honestly a disaster at the NFL level, but we'll see what happens there. I've thought a couple of different rule changes that the NFL has made would not be gone over well, and they've been there ever since. So it'll be interesting to watch. The kickoff, I'm all for. I think that's really exciting. I think it'll be a fun way to keep a team at least involved until the very last play. So I'm very excited for that. Obviously, right now, there's no concrete evidence that they are making super big strides towards making these a reality in college football. But the kickoff rule they are looking at, the hip drop tackle, I think they'll wait on for at least a year or two. But I would not be surprised if they made their way down to college football, and I will obviously keep you updated if any of these start to gain some traction, and we might see them in 2024 or 2025, probably more likely for any of these rule changes. But obviously some interesting things happening in the NFL, and when it happens in the NFL, we know college football might not be too far behind. But that'll do it for this opening segment, and we're going to go to a break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about RG3. He had some comments last week talking about Caleb Williams and the Bears. He had some comments this week talking about Shedeur Sanders and the possible opportunity for him to, quote-unquote, pull an Eli, as Dion put it. So I will talk about all of that right after this.